Okay, you can start.
All right. So yeah, we've arrived to the final chapter. This book. It's titled "Aspects of Failure." Very dramatic and sort of underwhelming, maybe. Why am I not able to? Okay. So this chapter doesn't really read like an epilogue. I mean, there's a lot of new content and new questions being presented here. But there's also, like, because it's the last chapter, there are some like overarching thoughts and conclusions offered by Dupuy. So I'll try to like present both of these aspects. And he starts like with a very like a general conclusion. Like he says that this history of cybernetics, which he's been presenting throughout the whole book, leaves him with a feeling of keen disappointment, like very strong words right at the start. So let's say a few words on what precisely is so disappointing to Dupuy here. So I've tried to capture this by let's just, yeah, so he begins like saying some positive things about cybernetics as well. So he says like this is regardless, this is a kind of a revolutionary approach to him, and it is praiseworthy because it introduces like into a kind of a rigorous naturalistic, let's call scientific framework concepts such as teleology, information, circular causality, feedback, and so on. And also by its method or approach, like it stands out as one of the most reflective scientific disciplines of its time. Like it reflects on its own methods and philosophical presuppositions, at least to some degree, right? So this is like, in this sense, like it is still for Dupuy something to be admired and learned from, but ultimately it fails for Dupuy. It fails in what it tries to achieve, or it has some crucial shortcomings. And this could be like captured, I think, by its reductionistic attitude, let's say, to some, to let's say, it reduces mental phenomena to physics, or better said, maybe to a very kind of idealized, a non-physicalist physics, like a kind of a simplified physics isn't able to capture what Dupuy think it should. And on the other side, we have like an artificialist philosophy of modeling, or also he says constructivist philosophy of modeling, which is to say that you have this idea that to know something, to know a phenomenon, is to be able to construct a model of it, and to have like an oversight and total control of all its kind of all its dynamic principles, or all of its dynamic laws. So to know something is to be able to totally reconstruct it, and to have like an idea of its dynamics fixed once and for all, right? So that would be like this crucial shortcoming, and we can talk about later what we may think about his or why this or if these presuppositions are really so problematic, and how they relate to other conclusions that Dupuy draws. But now I will just go on. So I will talk about the rest of this chapter, which is also structured like a continuation of his, like Dupuy is presenting like a series of missed encounters between cybernetics and some other disciplines which he thinks could be potential allies, or like disciplines which could offer some ways of overcoming these crucial shortcomings that Dupuy sees in cybernetics. So these two, so we've already gone through the life sciences and phenomenology in the previous chapters, and now we touch upon complexity theory on the other hand, on the one hand, and human and social sciences on the other. So we start with complexity theory. Dupuy isn't as clear as I would like on what exactly is complexity for him. Also, I mean, I personally have had trouble understanding this notion in other contexts. So maybe we can talk about this later. But the best way for me to flesh out what Dupuy here means by complexity is by way of his distinction between simple and complex approach to systems. So he says like there's this tension in cybernetics between these two approaches, and like the simple approach could be characterized as kind of reversibility between the parts and the whole, or between the top-down and bottom-up approach, or between considering the elements and their interconnections on the one side, and considering the whole, the properties of the whole on the other. And these two perspectives are, for a simple approach, reversible. So McCulloch could be like a good example of this approach for Dupuy. And he says like he's comfortable with both approaches. So the top-down approach would be, with McCulloch, would be like an equivalent to functionalism called nowadays. So in the sense that you define some properties of the whole, and like in terms of some functions. So in terms of how this whole interacts or with a given outside observer or with some environment. So we specify some input-output relationship between this whole, between the given system and some outside entity, right? And once you have this specified, let's say you say, I'm interested in a system that can, let's say, make some logical inferences, or maybe a system that can recognize some features of its environment. Then you can ask, what kind of relations between elements do I need to construct in order for this system to be able to satisfy this particular function? So this would be one approach taken by McCulloch, and the other approach would be bottom up. So you could say, you could start by perfectly specifying the elements and its interconnection, and then asking what kind of particular function does this system exemplify. And now the question is, why is this approach not enough? Like, what is this approach unable to capture? And for Dupuy, I think he says like there's one crucial shortcoming, and that is that it's unable to capture systems where both the function of the whole and the organization of its particular elements change throughout time. So this would be like the complex approach, where you have this codetermination between wholes, this temporal codetermination between parts and the whole. So you say that the functioning of the whole is not specified once and for all, but can change over time. And also the internal organization of its particular elements can change over time. And these two sides are like in a sort of like a circular interrelationship. Like the elements may rearrange so as to exemplify a different kind of functioning throughout time, and let's say the function of the whole may in turn influence the way the internal elements are organized, or the functioning of its particular elements. So that would be like a very abstract gist, I think, of what he means by complex systems. And an example of this might be like human societies or human group dynamics. Like these were like the participants of the Macy conferences that already for Dupuy kind of exemplified this kind of approach. So we have here Alex Bavelas, who's this social psychologist. And for Dupuy, he's interesting because he wasn't like asking he wasn't predetermining some specific function or some specific task that the group should be able to exemplify, but was asking what sort of different functions might different organizations of groups exemplify, or something like that. I'm not really sure, because this is a really brief example. And also we have animal societies, or like ecology, which also like goes more into this like complexity branch by notions such as like beehives or ant colonies, where you have like particular animals which do not explicitly act with the whole in mind, but like there still emerges a whole exemplifying some properties that are irreducible to its elements, but also it could go into a totally different direction. So it's not predetermined. It's not like a specific, it's not like once and for all specified functioning, but it emerges over time, something like this. But the best, I think, way to go deeper into this tension between simple and complex approaches is through the work of Ross Ashby, which is precisely why I think he goes into this, why Dupuy introduces Ashby at this point and goes and focuses quite a lot of attention on this character. So let's say something about Ashby. So he was a very interesting character. He's like he was trained as a psychiatrist, a biophysicist. I mean, and then he worked like as a biophysicist, a mathematician, and even taught electrical engineering at his later years. So he was like a perfect exemplification of this interdisciplinary spirit of cybernetics. And also Dupuy says that he was like a cornerstone of the second order cybernetics, which is, I'm not sure if this is completely accurate. And even the way Dupuy presents Ashby here, I think it would be better said that he was like the perfect embodiment of the transition between the first order and the second order cybernetics. So precisely this tension here is also what interests Dupuy, because he says, like, there are two aspects to his work that Dupuy here presents. The first is like a step in the right direction, let's say, where he is moving toward like understanding of complexity, like much more a deeper understanding of complexity than let's say his cybernetic predecessors. And on the other side, we have like a regression into metaphysics, as Dupuy calls it, and a kind of a failure, a perfect exemplification of why the early cybernetic project fails, according to Dupuy, which is exemplified by this citation, like axiomatizing complexity had the effect of making it vanish altogether. So let's go into both these sides of his work now. So first, let's consider the good side of Ashby. So how he moves toward complexity. And here I would say, like, this is, I've taken the liberty of going a bit beyond the text here, a little bit, but I'll also stick to it to some degree. So what is particular about Ashby is that he introduces like a whole new conception, a whole new framework for considering the mind, in contrast to some of his predecessors, such as McCulloch or even Winder, let's say, where he really isn't anymore like a kind of a proto-cognitivist. He rejects this idea that the mind should be considered as any kind of manipulation of symbols, or even be reduced to any particular specific function. So not to say that this isn't possible for Ashby. He still, I mean, he's not denying that the mind could be like a processing of like, say some logical relationships, but for him, I think he would say that this is like a very superficial understanding of the mind, and the deeper, more inclusive understanding for him would involve like some sort of capacity for self-organization, or some sort of maintenance of one's own essential structures. So for Ashby, cognition, like an organism, is a cognitive system because it has the capacity to act on its environment so as to maintain its own essential structures so that it is able to survive in light of some environmental perturbations. So in this sense, he has you could also say like a more radicalized physicalist understanding of the mind. So he likens this to, I mean, he says that this is a kind of a stability, a property of like many physical systems already on a very simple level. You could say like here I included like a pendulum is a very like a classical example of stability, where you could say that it has some variable which it tends, or you could say it wants to maintain this variable of standing vertically and resist perturbation in this sense. And also, like we could say a ball which you roll down the hill in this picture next to it. And there were some objections even from his cybernetic peers in this sense, along these lines of, yeah, but isn't this an oversimplifications? Like, how can you say that the ball rolling down a hill really intelligently finds the lowest point? Is this really intelligence? And here even Dupuy, I think, seems here sympathetic to this objection. But I would say that this is really missing the point here, because of course Ashby is not simply saying that intelligence or cognition can be equated with this most simple kind of stability. But there's at least one additional layer of complexity, let's say, that you have to add on to that. So here I said this is like cognition more specifically for Ashby would be what he calls ultra stability, or you could also say like the system not only has to maintain its essential variables, but it has to be able to learn new ways of maintaining them. So it has to be able to correct its behavior if its behavior doesn't have the desired effect. So this is exemplified by his notion of the homeostat. So this is, it could be like the most rudimentary schematic way how Ashby understands a cognitive system. So I'll just very briefly explain how what this is about. So we have this picture on the lower right side. This is the homeostat, and the dotted line here is encircles the organism or the cognitive agent, and this half blue circle on the outside is the environment. Okay, and the lower half circle is what you could call a sensory motor system. So this is the part, this is the system that interacts with the environment in some specified, some deterministic way. So you could say it has some rules of action, rules of behavior encoded in it. So if let's say environment, if the organism sees food, it approaches. If the organism sees a predator, it evades, and so on, right? But then the environment also acts on its essential variables, which are coded, which are presented here like with this clock thingy. And when the essential variables go dangerously out of bounds, let's say that it's dangerously low, let's say glucose levels, the essential variables will initiate some sort of change in its sensory motor system. So it will randomly perturb the motor system until it finds some sort of solution to this problem. So until it finds a new way of behaving which addresses this drop in viability levels. And so the organism, the point is here is that you don't have to specify in advance what kind of behavior this system has to accomplish. You can randomly set any sort of behavior, and you can just drop this system in its environment, and it will most likely it will tend to learn modes of behavior which are conducive to its mode of being, right? And this is a very neat idea, in my opinion, because it brings together two crucial shortcomings, which also Dupuy, I think, is throughout the whole of this book is kind of pointing out in the early cybernetic projects two shortcomings or two blind spots that you could say that the early cybernetic movement had about the mind, about cognitive systems. One would be this kind of understanding of self-interest, of self-organization, of this kind of meaning, in the sense of an organism having an interest in itself, in its own survival, and in what happens around it, right? So this would be captured. This is what Ashby is trying to capture with this idea of stability. And also the other blind spot would be this idea of the new, the creativity, you could say, like the ability to change one's behavior, to invent new modes of behavior and thinking, and so forth. So this is, I think, what's really interesting about Ashby, that he introduces both of this idea and even kind of very neatly shows how these two aspects of cognitive systems interrelate, right? So yeah, so this is something that really I'm personally very impressed by Ashby on this point. But Dupuy, not so much. Evidently, he is much less impressed. In fact, he dismisses Ashby quite harshly on subsequent pages, which came a little bit as a surprise to me. It's a little surprising, at least. So there are some arguments, counter arguments that Dupuy puts forward here. Like he even says, like, he dismisses Ashby as kind of Ashby's arguments were a kind of sleight of hand. So, or he says, like, once its pedagogical simplicity has been seen through, nothing remains but the trick it plays on the unsuspecting. So really harsh words. And the problem, so what were the problems here for Dupuy? There was one argument about, like, Ashby's view on how adaptive systems should naturally evolve, or nature as it, like, there's a fundamental property to nature that that adaptive systems necessarily evolve and become ever more adaptive through time. And this is something that Dupuy says, like, Ashby here just passes a conventional mathematical definition as a universal principle of nature, because the problem is this tendency towards adaptivity, you could say, is just a property of finite automata as we define them, is that where they start with a lot of variability, with a lot of possible states, like there's this statistical feature of these systems that they will tend toward some point of attractor, and this attractor could be defined as a kind of point of stability or some system. But I think that this wasn't really Ashby's argument precisely, or at least if one distinguishes between stability and ultra stability, there, I think the argument is a little bit more complex, at least. I mean, I'm not perfectly satisfied with Ashby's views on this either, but not for the same reasons as Dupuy, because but yeah, we can go into that later. In any case, it's interesting to think about this contention that mathematical features of our models cannot in any way be indicative of rules of nature, right? And okay, so the next argument is much more, let's say, much more central. Also, it goes, I think, deeper into actual problems with Ashby, and also is kind of behind the whole, is implicit in the whole rest of the chapter. So this idea that although Ashby's conception of the mind was intended precisely to capture some sort of generation of new behavior, some sort of creativity, it ultimately fails in this regard. So there's nothing that the system can really produce. There's no creativity. There's nothing new about this system. It cannot produce any sort of novelty. It cannot, as Dupuy says, surprise its creator. Like a truly complex system should be able to do this, in his view, whereas Ashby's homeostat ultimately only surprises someone who doesn't really grasp what the fundamental dynamic principles of the systems are. And this is something that Ashby readily admits. In fact, there's this famous criticism of the notion of self-organization put forward by Ashby, which is precisely related to this point. So Ashby says that the notion of self-organization should be abandoned because it is sort of self-contradictory, at least if you start from like this kind of framework of modeling it in terms of a finite automata or in any kind of dynamic systems kind of state-determined framework. So his point is that the organization here, which Ashby is talking about, is encapsulated in the dynamic laws of some system. Like so, the connections between nodes embody some sort of dynamic principles of how this network will interact, right? And you can formalize these principles with a certain function. You can say you have some variables, and then we have some mapping between some state and some particular state that comes after. And this mapping is determined once and for all. Okay, so, and this mapping is what formalizes the organization of the particular system. And then Ashby says, like, of course, so now it's a logical contradiction if you say that some element in this network or some variable modifies the dynamic principles of the entire system. That is impossible because it is part of this system. It is already the dynamic laws already take into account what it's going to do and how it interacts within that system, right? And this is just like a very plain logical conclusion that Ashby arrives at. And also, like he also says, I mean, Ashby also says that this is what you have to take into account with his homeostat, because the way that homeostat self-organizes is precisely because it is constituted of different parts. And you cannot say of this whole system that it self-organizes. It just is the way it is, and it behaves the way it behaves, and you cannot it cannot by itself alter that. But you can say that the essential variables organize the sensory motor system. So you can only say that it organizes itself insofar as one part dominates some other part. One part organizes some other part. In this sense, you could speak about self-organization. So this is also very nicely related or encapsulated by Hofstadter, where he said in some unrelated text that no matter how a program twists and turns to get out of itself, it still follows the rules inherent in itself. A computer program, or in here I added, or any dynamic system, can modify itself, but it cannot violate its own instructions or laws. It can at best change some parts of itself by obeying its own instructions. So, and here I would add that this is, I mean, it's interesting to think about this because Ashby here is not just, this is not just a feature of homeostat or any particular kind of structure, but of dynamic systems themselves. Ashby is pointing out here something, some very general conclusion about the whole framework of how we think about nature within physics. And what he's saying is that self-organization isn't possible on any level in any kind of organization, right? And the question now is, like, how would you get out of this bind? Because Dupuy here isn't really very clear. I mean, he does put forward some brief clues. Like he says that there are some like some frameworks within like this disorganized systems, I think he says, and dissipative structures, and at least in some levels of chemistry, I think he says that there is a push towards like reformalizing state functions, or like getting rid of state functions and formalize and trying out different methods which could capture this kind of self-organization. But yeah, it's very unclear to me how Ashby would conceive of an alternative. So that would be like a very interesting point of discussion for me. Okay, but let's move on now. So now we go on to the section of covering the social sciences, but the transition here is very smooth because, as Ashby points out, as Dupuy points out, there's like this very the issue here presented by Ashby about self-organization is actually something that the social sciences by themselves have hit upon, a very similar, or you could say formally the same problem posed here by Debra, a social scientist that says something very similar about the problem of self-government. So he says, the government of the collective by itself is a logical impossibility. There can be no organized system without closure, and no system can be closed by elements internal to that system alone. And I think Dupuy says that this is somehow based on Gödel's theorem. I'm presuming that that he's talking about the incompleteness theorem, but yeah, I could sort of imagine how these things could be related, but I'm not really sure. So if anybody else has some insights into this, would also be interesting. But yeah, one could, I mean, of course, we could see the issue here is related, right? And you can imagine how this crosses over into the social domain. Also, another point of contact between cybernetics and social sciences are this concept of subjectless processes. So this is something also something that the social sciences have by themselves, or even before cybernetics, have hit upon this issue and thought through a lot of these things. So you have on the other, it's interesting that he here draws a close connection between like the free market liberalism by Friedrich von Hayek, and let's say structural Marxism by Louis Althusser, which on the surface you could say that they could not be more different, but in this regard you could say that they both draw on this notion that you have certain processes, certain social structures which take on like quasi-subjective properties, and which develop individually what's the word here? Which are not dependent on any particular individual's will or cognition. So you can, of course, think of this idea of the invisible hand of the market as being one kind of this idea of an emergent structure, some sort of rationality that emerges out of particular interests of individuals, but does not really follow any one of these particular, does not really obey the laws that any one particular element would control. So in this sense, you could say, Dupuy says that we can talk about complex individualism, where you have this sort of emergent whole. And on the other side, he doesn't really say a lot about Louis Althusser. And I would add here like a provocation, maybe. I'm really not so familiar with Althusser, but what I do know about him is that one could say maybe that he emphasizes a different side to social complexity as Friedrich von Hayek, whereas whereas from Hayek goes from the, let's say, bottom up, where he says like you have these individuals which interact, and then you have some sort of emergent superstructure. The structural Marxism goes the other way around. Like he starts from the superstructure and is interested primarily with how the superstructure feeds back upon the individual. So how the individual is produced by the superstructure. Like you don't have any sort of pre-given individuals to work with, but you have some sort of plastic mass which you have to subjectivate in the first place. So this other side of how complex systems feeds back upon themselves, right? That would be just one kind of my point maybe for further discussion. And then we finish with this Dupuy's insight into how there's also a kind of like cybernetics also, it allows for going beyond the classical individualism. So it allows us to treat this social or any kind of higher order structures as a kind of quasi subjects, which, although they are not structurally similar to us, could exemplify some sort of learning, some sort of decision making, and so on. And also there's this process going the other way, where cybernetics actually deconstructs subjectivity at its core. So it really shows that we are all quasi subjects in this regard. So we do not have any sort of substantial subjectivity, but ourselves kind of emergent processes which exist as a kind of on the level of collective, are produced by some sort of emergent behavior of our own constituents. So in this, you could say, is apparent like by different ideas of contemporary or recent cognitive scientists like Dennett, who has this notion of non-selfish selves, and Varela, of course, with his notion of selfless selves, and also Minsky by his society of mind, and so on. So this idea is really pertinent in cognitive science. And so, Dupuy here doesn't offer any dramatic, any overarching conclusion, but just concludes with this, that the individual and the social subjects are comparable precisely because they are mechanized. And here, the final question which I would have for the discussion is, like, what is, I'm actually quite confused here on what Dupuy's take on this is, or why. I mean, in some sense, he seems like he supports this move, like this idea of quasi-subjects and the deconstruction of substantial subjectivity. This seems somehow okay and very like interesting and productive for him. But then he says something like, yes, but this is this like we and the quasi-subjects, societal quasi-subjects are comparable precisely because we are both mechanized. So in this sense, he seems to be very uncomfortable with this position. So I'm not exactly sure what his final take on this would be. But yeah, that was my presentation. So we can go on discussion.
Okay, maybe you close the
Yeah.
presentation or stop the share.
Yeah. All right.
Hello to everyone. Hey Tarja, hey Andrea. Yeah, very nice presentation, I have to say, Timotej, nicely done, especially the Ashby part. That was very, very clear. So, okay, a general question first, because Andrea and Daria are here. So would you prefer that we go to discussion, or would you like to discuss maybe some meta topics, given the fact that this is the last session? So, or should we wait a little bit with that?
Well, I don't need any preference here because I haven't been present in most of these talks, but thanks for the talk. I understood still something of it, even though I didn't read most of the book. But let's have the meta talk afterwards and just
Okay.
talk about the chapter.
Okay, the discussion first.
Presentation, I guess. What do you think, Andrea?
No, that's totally fine with me. So I would be especially interested in this Ashby part, which I also. So why don't we just start with the discussion?
Yes, you can start with a question about Ashby, Andrea.
Oh, I liked your diagram which you had, from the environment and then from this this system which we marked with the R, which is the which how we perceive, from the outside, and this interconnection, in how they are connected in finding these stable states. So how he's, I would like to understand better how he goes, this second order of cybernetics. So how they went, from these quite organized systems with the feedback loops and got to this very different view of which included this complexity and these interactions and couplings. And I have the feeling there's so much material in there, but maybe you could explain it a little bit better, and so that, just to get a better grasp on it.
Do you mean that do you mean me that what precisely what you would like to be explained?
So why could you start with this diagram you had?
Yeah.
And show with the diagram. So how this kind of this randomness. We have this coupling between the observer or the conscious mind and the environment, and how to find these stable points. So and quite frankly, so what are these stable points? And so I think I have the feeling I'm missing so much at this point here. So
yeah, we can go for back to the diagram for a second. You can guide me through. I mean, I can say something about it, and then you can guide me if you. But let me just yeah. So let's share the screen again. Okay. So do you see?
Yeah.
Okay. So okay. Yeah, the diagram really doesn't. Yeah, it is very schematic. So. So, like the variables which the system tries to maintain are here. Like you could say this could also be like replaced with some variable, let's say x, and this x has like a range of, let's say, between 1 and 100. Let's say that's temperature. I mean, there's many different variables here. It could be right. So, but let's say just temperature. Let's say between 0 and 100. And let's say that the organism survives between 15 and 25. And so when the temperature drops below, then you have some sort of step mechanism here. So you could say, you could encode this by some step function. So step function is just, for anyone who doesn't know, it's just a function that has like these continuous jumps. So you could say when the temperature is between 15 and 25 to nothing, and then when it drops below that, initiate some change, like jump to a different state, and beyond that jump to a different state. And then when this step function jumps to another state, it parameterizes this this system here. And this you could also formalize in some kind of mathematical function. You could say that this is a kind of coupling, right? And this coupling is parameterized by this function here. So this function here just says, if you jump to another state, like if I'm in state, let's say 0 is no change, and let's say 1 is change. So when I'm in 1, initiate, like you could have some sort of random number generator. So let's say you initiate random number generator, and so this random number generator would parameterize, like would perturb this sensory motor system. Like, and here I cannot really explain, because I guess you could imagine this in all sorts of different ways. I mean, more or less complex, but you could say you just had some, like, on the most basic level, you could have some like rules, like if, I don't know, if I see fire, I move towards it, and then when the system is cold, he's more incentivized to do this. Like you can like imagine to formalize this in any kind of way. I mean, I'm not really apt to talk about this in any kind of very specific way, but in terms of, like, if you were to program a computer to do something like this, or a robot, you can imagine also sorts of ways, like how would you parameterize this in so that this changes. But the one crucial point is this: for Ashby, this is not a guided, like the step function doesn't guide automatically the system towards better modes of behavior. This is random. Like this is the point. This is just a random perturbation. It introduces a random change in the sensory motor system, and it does this so long as the sensory motor system is not in the right condition, so as to affect the environment, so that the environment now affects the essential variables, that the variables are corrected. And when it does this, it automatically stops changing. So this is how it finds a new attractor, you could say. It finds a new point of balance, which includes a new kind of way of acting on the environment, so that the environment is corrected, is brought in line with what is conducive to the survival of the organism. I hope this was clear, or was it still kind of, are there some questions about this?
So what you are saying is the sensory motor system. So when it's when it acts back on the environment, this is also random, and it does it as long as the environment is changed in such a way that this system will get into a stable state.
Yes.
So there is no rules.
Yeah, no rules. The only rule, the only non-random thing about this system is this connection here. This is the only non-random one. And it says that it must necessarily stay. So this step mechanism, which perturbs the sensory motor system, must stay passive as long as the essential variables are within bounds, and must act when they are out of bounds. This is the only, like, non-random rule. And how this how the actual interaction between the sensory motor system and the environment takes place, this is completely random.
And this is the way how he avoids that, you have a closed systems and a closed system where if you want to change something, you have to change the rules. And in order to change the rules, you have to have you have these levels. So you change the rule, but then there has to be something which initiates changing the rules. So you avoid this whole rule changing mechanism by introducing the randomness.
Yes, something like that. I mean, what he's saying is,
this is why it cannot be a closed system. It has to be this kind of coupling to the environment.
Yes, I mean, it's not a closed system because what he's trying to model is the interaction between the organism and the environment. Like his main, I mean, his point is that he wants a model of how the organism goes from an unadaptive state to an adaptive state. So if you have an organism that doesn't know how to respond to the environment properly, so avoid danger, seek food and stuff like that. So how does it, by what mechanism could it arrive at the state of adaptivity, at the state of where it is able to correctly address environmental perturbations? And he says that it's really simple. Like it's just, you just have to have this sort of, you just have to search by trial and error until you satisfy your like bounds of viability, basically. But this is just a very schematic, like proof of concept, you could say. This is not like a workable model where you cannot implement this in any sort of like artificial intelligence, robotics framework directly, right? Because you have to specify more concretely what is going on here, which I really don't know if anybody has tried. I mean, Ashby is known to have made this machine called the homeostat, which was just like a collection of kind of electric transducers, and he showed like how these could be concretely implemented, but not in any kind of way that would resemble an organism or anything like that. It was just like a proof of concept also.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. This was very helpful.
Moritz has a question. He says that he's a bit confused about the link to evolution. Namely, if a dynamic system goes into a stable state, how does it keep evolving and adapting to the environment?
So yeah, I mean, I can try to answer that, but
yes, do your best, Timotej.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing for the individual organism to seek some point of stability, but it's a totally something else to like. Here you're just considering the individual organism and its immediate environment as a system, and within this framework you can specify a point of stability for that organism. But when you take account the whole like temporal dimension of evolution and like the series of reproduction cycles and so on, this is a whole different system. You could say this would be a kind of a meta system that Ashby talks about. You always have to introduce some sort of meta perspective, some different kind of system, like you say, some larger system, in order to account how something changes. And this would be in some ways this could be like an illustration of that. Like so you have this, and this is just a kind of point of view, right? Because a system is a point of view. It's not a ontological object. I mean, it's not a thing in itself. Like to say that an organism is a system is just to say we are going to be interested in just these concrete variables and nothing else. And within this system, within this set of variables, we can define some sort of attractor and some point of stability. But this point of stability isn't really an ontological thing, right? Because you are not really stable. If you were to consider all the actual variables, all the actual things that are going on, then you would see that you are not really this ideal stable point which always finds its way back to its point of origin. You are a concrete organism that has to that dies, that gets hurt, that fails in its way to achieve homeostasis a lot of times. So in this sense, you could say, right, that an evolution is also a kind of system where you are not really stable, where something is evolving, but this is not apparent on the level where you are trying to describe homeostasis or self-organization of an individual or stuff like that. I hope I was clear on that.
Waiting for Morit's response. Well, maybe in the meantime, yes, taking an epistemic perspective on that makes more sense. Okay, I would touch upon precisely this and then relate this to something else. If this is not an ontological category, what are the criteria of differentiation as to why you would, so what allows you to focus on systems like this, and what prevents you to make random classifications? Or can you just do like, we seem to focus on these particular parameters because some fairly contingent factors like our evolutionary history or particular interests, and we could literally slice up the whole dynamic systems into innumerable different ways? Or are there any criteria that prevent this? And if so, how is this not at least partly ontological?
Does anybody else want to? I mean,
I think that you're the guy.
I mean,
fellow.
I can ramble on, but
Yeah, let's see if somebody wants to chime in prior to that. I think that you will have to.
I mean, I would say that it's just a matter of, I would imagine it like a kind of sito, cum se zice sito în englishă?
Sieve.
Sieve, like a kind of a sieve where you, like a system in this sense, like it is a kind of a sieve where you capture some features of the world and let others slide through the cracks, right? So the question is, just which the question boils down to which features are important to you in which context, right? So as any kind of conceptual practice is forced to deal with this problem, like however you conceptualize some part of the world, you will have some features that stand out and some features that stand in the background, are not really captured by your conceptual apparatus. And I think with mathematical modeling is the same, right? You just have to, because in the sense, like, I'm not saying that self-organization, let's say self-organization or homeostasis or adaptivity, as Ashby conceptualizes it, is not an actual feature of the world. It's just to say that the model is most, let's say, it's not really an attractor if you are taking a larger picture. But to say that when you take this boxed-in view of the organism and see an attractor, this still tells you something about the organism. It tells you that it strives to move towards some point, but of course it fails because you have also this whole other mess of things going on around it. And I think it's still a very interesting and ontologically pertinent point to say that we have this sort of stable learning systems, the way Ashby captures it. I think it tells us a lot about their organization. It just doesn't tell us everything. It tells us nothing about their evolution and so on. Like, this is something that you have to add or adopt a different framework for.
Would you consider one way of thinking about it is as a, for example, the way phenomenologists talk about the relationship between aspects and the thing, but only here you create the aspects that allow you to see the thing through them, just so you never see the object, but you see always the Abschattung of the object, so one aspect of it. But that doesn't mean, like empiricists think, that you just see the two-dimensional image you see the object, but from a certain perspective. So would that be like a
I think
certain,
that would,
because otherwise one gets really, really close to some sort of idealism and constructivism, which I know you wouldn't want to defend. So that's why I'm asking you about this.
I think that this is very close to it.
But I still, okay, maybe I'm not going to push this. I just a brief comment. I do have so this ontological question about the tractors, whether they're just like, you know, features that I have the impression that there should be an ontological element to them.
I mean, I'm also very interested in this, so you can go on.
No, I'm not sure how to articulate it. I just have the impression that there should be a certain ontological something about it, but not sure how to go about. So the second question I wanted to ask, and then I hope that others will chime in. One thing that on the one hand, this picture or image of Ashby's model or the organism, the way he presents it, seems very neat and open because it introduces the element of randomness and makes it like an integral part of the whole story. But at the same time, it's, even though it has the element of randomness, it's like very, very boxed. So you have the box with the parameters that are predetermined, and like we pretend that, okay, that's just how it is. That's one thing. And the other thing is also this the second part where you have the sensory motor relationships with the environment. It's also just, you know, it's kind of there, and we say, well, if this happens, then do this, and we seem to presuppose that we know how this happens, but that's precisely one of the questions that's most important. So how do you get to the point where you get a certain stability of this sort? So the randomness is just an element that can easily blind you, because you say, wow, okay, you know, this is how you can shift the things without, but at the same time, it presupposes a lot that is precisely the question that is really important. So I would just maybe ask you, I know that you have done a lot of Canguilhem, and I think that this is basically precisely what his main critique of, say, mechanicist approaches is, where he says that, you know, the mechanical account of a certain constants, physiological constants, are just like statistical averages, and he's constantly bashing on that and says that it is the organism as a whole that will show you what are the relevant parameters for it, and you will always have to take into account both the organism and its environment to even get there. So he's just kind of pretending that this is not a question, it's just there, and he's focusing on a minor point that it's interesting. I cannot you know, say that it isn't, especially if you're trying to model something that is somewhat mechanistic, but I'm just wondering whether it's truly addressing the most important points about vital systems. So that's the
there's a lot of interesting things to say about that. I mean, one thing I would say, like, of course, I mean, I personally am also a bit dissatisfied with Ashby's like general presuppositions. Like one thing, like I've recently written an article on precisely this issue with Ashby. I mean, it goes more in the direction of the extended mind, but one basic point which I try to make there is that you cannot understand human agents in terms of having fixed, prearranged bounds of viability, fixed essential variables, because this doesn't work with humans. It just doesn't seem like the right approach to model human behavior, to say that you always have this kind of clock which is predetermined and just like a once and for all fixed kind of point of like a fixed point of your attracting your modes of behavior. Like you can obviously posit different kind of let's say fundamental goals of your being, of your life, which do actually, I think, can be captured at least very schematically with this Ashbyan principle of like they sculpt behavior in this kind of quasi-random sense. Like you have some points which are somehow encoded within your let's say, within your organism that sculpt the way you interact so that you move towards some point of, let's say, interest, but you can also change them. So what I try to propose is that you have to add another layer of complexity where you have systems which not only act on the basis of some bounds of viability, but also internally there's a feedback loop which changes those bounds of viability. So that was like a kind of a proposal, very abstract proposal, which I think is very related actually to Canguilhem. I think I had some sort of also, I was quite inspired by Canguilhem on this point, I think.
By the way, this relates to, so the even if we exclude human beings, so one of the issues that I had here is also that environment seems like this unchangeable blob, as it often is. The problem is, so here's a picture. The organism influences the environment in such a way that it creates a niche within which the parameters themselves can change. So it can change its own parameters, not by, you know, just allowing them to go up and down and then finding something, but because the organism also interacts with the environment, and the environment is not just, you know, something that is always there and is unchanged, but it's something that you can affect.
Yeah, but that is captured by Ashby. Sorry if I...
No, but if you change it in this particular way, I mean, with him, with this picture, what I have is this like a very crude attempt to synthesize determinism with radical indeterminacy. But you can also have a certain something that is, in a certain sense, guided, and it's neither. So you respond to certain something, you change the environment, and when you change the environment, you change your clock without getting into the position where you become this crazy something that is seeking for a solution. So the catastrophic reaction is a rare event in animals. It happens rarely. So for the most part, they will find themselves, even in situations where they fight or something, they're structured, they're very structured. So I think that there's an overt, like too big of an emphasis on this randomness that is unguided randomness.
Yeah. That's a good point, actually. I think Ashby also talks about this, that in practice, this simple model would be very unviable, because if you were just to throw these kinds of organisms into environment, very few of them would actually survive, because it's a very chaotic process, actually, right? So this random trial and error searching for new like modes of behavior. And I mean, this is just like a very small tip of the iceberg for Ashby, like this schemata which I presented here. Like if you're interested in this, like his book Design for a Brain, like goes in very much more detail in this direction, and it's really interesting to me, right? And there he discusses all sorts of these issues. Like he says, yes, of course, like there's a process of evolution for him that takes care of most of these problems, in the sense that, yes, you end up with organisms that are very much predeterminedly organized so that they don't have to perturb their own modes of behavior. They are already sort of very much in tune with their environments, and they don't have to do this all the time. This is a very, precisely what he says, this is a very rare event in actual organisms. It is just there as a kind of failsafe, a kind of cold shower kind of learning, where you really have to switch up your, adapt to something very drastically different than what you're used to. In that sense, I think that the randomness really is important for Ashby.
Just a very brief follow-up on this one. So does he have this element of environment being changed by the organism, and that there's like a bidirectional moment? So,
yeah, that's also very much discussed by him. And also, yeah,
because that's important in how he understands evolution as well, right?
Yeah, but of course, also he's not very, I mean, he's not an evolutionary theorist. He doesn't go into those issues like concretely, specifically. He just, I mean, he's just interested primarily in how like a given individual organism operates within its environment and leaves other issues aside. So, I mean, he's more of a kind of a physiologist in that sense. But what I want to say, I wanted to say something else, but I forgot.
Maybe Andrea or Tarja, this idea of Rosens and other similar people who talk about these landscapes through which the organisms goes. I think that, I don't know, I have the impression that this could be maybe somehow relevant to this. Because I think this dichotomy that sometimes crops up between like radical randomness and then determination, it's not really something that you see. You always see like the realm of guided randomness, so which is precisely the realm of the possible, which we talked about, Andrea, right? Because there's a difference if you have like a random. I sometimes even, and if I understand correctly, it's not really that trivial what randomness is. So what constitutes randomness? You can say there's a yeah, I don't know how to particularly phrase this, but
can I just jump in really quick, because I had this exact. I was thinking about this exact issue the other day. Like, how do you conceptualize this random step in Ashby's diagram? Is actually, you could say, a kind of a guided randomness. It's not pure randomness because it's constrained by the essential variables. So it's a very tricky thing to define. Like, it's not a stochastic system, and it's also not a completely deterministic system. It's a kind of guided stochastic system, right? But just that, yes.
Andrea, this is, in a certain sense, it's like similar to what Rosen is doing in the domain of evolution, if I understood correctly. So he's also trying to have like these. You know, this is just like I might be completely off, but from what we were talking about, this attempt to have certain landscapes like within the domain of possibility, which is not completely at random, but has a certain, I don't know, maybe you should go over here so that I don't send anything silly.
Yeah, I have to now to try to connect this. So this kind of.
You can maybe just first explain the Rosen's position, and then we can see the, you know, we can take it from there. It might be easier that way.
I mean, Rosen is also talking about self-organization in a way. So he wants to understand how systems are able to organize. And this is what reminded, you know, when you were talking about the rules. So one of his problems is when you have a metabolic system, so that this metabolic system, so in order to have these, you know, to function smoothly, so the system has to know in advance when it's running out of a specific enzyme and to produce more. So it has to, you know, foresee what is coming. And this he tries to. This is one of his these problems he tries to solve, because you always have to have something which controls it and make sure that you produce enough. But in order to have this, you need a second instance, which is, you know, controlling the first one. So you get into this circle. You understand what I mean? So this is why he has this he introduces, you know, these category theory. This is the only way, you know, where you have a system which can, you know, react on itself. So you don't need these kind of, you know, never ending, you know, instances, or, you know, these circles of productions and controlling. So I'm not sure now what you're meaning with the landscape. What kind of landscape you have in mind in when you
evolutionary on within evolution and the realm of possibilities that we were talking about.
Yeah, but this is the realm of possibilities. So I think you are talking about Kaufmann.
Oh yeah, Kaufman. We talked about Kaufman with regards to this, right?
So, and
Stuart Kaufman, right?
yeah, Stuart Kaufman, and Kaufman, I found it interesting. He mentioned in this book that Stuart Kaufman was a student of McCulloch. I didn't know this. So it's in the beginning of this chapter. And, you know, he introduced these Boolean networks, these random Boolean networks. And one has to look, you know, how he defines random here. So what, you know, how, because this is a mathematical model. So how he's implementing this random process. And then he finds these kind of structures in these random networks. And from there, I think this whole thing on self-organization, so that these random systems can also have the property of self-organization. So this, do you have to correct me if it's not true or it's not correct, Timothy, as I, you know, my understanding of this. But what Stuart Kaufman, what he was introducing is that he said that, you know, it's a kind of coupling between the organism and the environment. So the environment is changing, and it's only, you know, the space of possibility. It's a, you know, of evolutionary possibilities is a space which is growing, which is it's expanding. So this means to Kaufman's work. So it's expanding. So it's, you know, when the environment is changing, it also offers new possibilities for the organisms. So that it creates new niches into which these organisms can evolve, in which direction these organisms can evolve. This means that it enables, this is a kind of enablement of, you know, of evolving organisms. So this is how, you know, Kaufman calls this the adjacent possible. So the possibilities are for evolution, you know, for the evolving organism is coupled to the environment, to the changes in the environment. So at a specific point in time, so the environment is determining, so what kind of changes these organisms can undergo, or in which direction they can evolve.
I think this is really, really important, like with regards to the implications for both the Ashby's ideas and, of course, the more general implications, which probably the more orthodox evolutionary theories would have issues with, right? Because it seems like most of them don't really want to have anything that seems even remotely somehow moving in the direction of some sort of directedness or limitedness or guidedness, and Kaufman is bringing this into the picture. So with these adjacent possibilities, you basically create spaces of possibility within which it seems that the certain something would happen is more likely. So you basically do create certain conditions for a certain development or change to occur. So it loses its randomness, if I understand correctly, right? Like this utter randomness.
Yeah, it loses its randomness by, you know, creating these possibilities, and therefore, and I think just given the idea that the space of possibilities is something which is expanding, and it's not pre-given. So it's something which most evolutionary biologists don't like the idea. So people like Dennett would never, you know, subscribe to this kind of view. For him, you know, everything is, you know, every possibility for an organism to evolve or to become is pre-stated.
Yeah, and Timotej, when we were talking about Plessner, one of his ideas was this precisely, that the organism is never, it never coincides with itself, but it's already always like above itself. And I think that Plessnerian critique of Ashby would be that it fails to introduce a meaningful account of this moment where the organism will not only just change in a specific manner, but in a manner that would be directed with regards to what it kind of is striving towards. So it has a certain momentum and it tries to maintain it. I think that this might be
but isn't, I mean, in some ways, this is precisely the point with the essential variables, like the changes that it undergoes are always directed with regard to its essential variables, its interest, you could say, its vital interest.
But I have the impression that what Andrea said before with regards to Rosen, that that is always like one step ahead of the actual changes. You know what I mean?
But I'm not yet. No, I'm actually not sure what you mean.
That it has the element of expectation of something happening before it happens and moving in the direction of context that would allow it to either preserve this or change the parameter itself in a way where this wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
So without necessarily getting to the point where this happens and then you get into the frantic position and go crazy, but you are kind of, you know, so it's difficult to talk about this without introducing the notion of telos somehow, but you know, like this.
Again, I mean, this is just the most fundamental, the most abstract schematic way which he presents it. I mean, the sensory motor system as a whole is represented just as a single variable, which is very like rudimentary. I mean, when he goes into specifics, like he tries to unfold this, like there's a lot of things going on within the sensory motor system, right? And I'm not, I mean, there's also, he talks about foresight. I mean, this is a crucial issue for him, how the sensory motor system not only reacts to something as a kind of a reflex, but also kind of anticipates what's going on out there. But we can go forward to, like, let's say, contemporary debates around like the free energy principle maybe and predictive processing and stuff like that. I think this would be a kind of a framework which could embrace Ashbean starting position and try to like precisely move into the direction of how such a system might be able to predict what's going on and maintain its essential variables in that way.
But this would mean to go back to physics, to base all this on physical principles.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure this is a kind of actually a controversial point, I think, within the free energy principle community. I mean, what exactly, like, on what level do you ground this principle? I think some are happy with saying that this is just an abstract encoding of what goes on within, like, say, a neural net, and some other, like, let's say, Friston would really go push this, like, very, very to some very fundamental physical levels, let's say. I mean, recently I think he's written some articles where he says, like, to exist is to minimize free energy principle, free energy, and so it's a kind of becomes a sort of ultimate metaphysics of being for him, and this is a whole other debate. But I think that, yeah, what I was trying to say is more along this a more kind of sober, more high level approach, where you say, like, you have some neural net which has a free energy as a kind of a cost function or something along those lines.
Can I ask you one question? So with these random nets and, the observation that you have some kind of structures or patterns in those nets. So how decisive or how essential was this observation for Ashby to talk about this, or coming up with this very schematic thing you were presenting up with the sensory motor system and coupling to the environment and so on? And, we are now, what we are discussing when we talk about Kaufman, and so this seems to me, we try to put even some more some more structure into it. It seems to me that we redefine this very schematic mathematical model he's putting up there. So in order to get closer to any kind of biological system. So what we are doing here with this, for me, these are all models. These are mathematical models. So, and it seems that, this kind of tension between, you have these mathematical terms like randomness, and you have patterns, you have connections and interactions. And on the other hand, you have these biological organisms, and, you just try to find out if, how these two sides are coming together. So am I thinking in the right direction, or is it?
I'm not sure what's precisely your question.
My question is, I have the impression that Ashby started out from this observation of random nets. You have these random networks and you have patterns in them, and then you think about self-organization. So these kind of systems can, they can have the ability to self-organize. But is really this self-organization, is this captured in this kind of, totally captured in this kind of random nets, or do we have to become more defined about this? And you said, that Ashby wrote himself about this, that we, this kind of guidedness, which is also an element in his mathematical model. So it seems to me that you start out with a very schematic mathematical model, and you become more and more specific in this mathematical model and try to adapt it to specific situations, and maybe even bring it closer to biological systems. And so it's a kind of this going back and forth between, here we have biology and here we have these mathematical models.
Yeah. I mean, one thing about Ashby is, I think his approach is very kind of it's quite different than what predominantly happens in science today, where you have, it's very untypical for scientists today to try to start from first principles and then move towards the concrete, like gradually. I think today it's much more like you have some specific phenomena, let's say you start out from observing some particular kind of organism and try to describe some specific process and with him it's the other way around, right? So you have just very general abstract schematic principles, and then you slowly kind of try to move towards like how you describe it, like you adapt it to certain contexts and say, okay, maybe here when we were talking about humans, it's something totally different than, let's say, talking about frogs or individual cells or anything like that. You have to fill in the gaps when you want to try to describe anything specific with his model. And I'm not sure how far he got. I mean, he never really tried to like he didn't propose this theory as a kind of empirical theory of how any specific living organism actually operates. It's not predictive in that sense, his theory. Like it's just like a groundwork for some future theory which might actually describe anything, anything specific.
I think you have the same in systems biology. You also start from very, from principles and try to see how, how it could relate to any kind of biological system, because you at the same time you perform experiments and all this kind of stuff. But at sometimes when I always have the feeling, and also with Ashby and all these people, that they have been prisoners of their own mathematical models. And but that's this is what I observed with Rosen, that Rosen couldn't get really out of these mathematical models because he didn't have the means, but he had a mathematical model which would fulfill these very basic features he wanted them to have, but he had no way of really what to do next with this.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is actually one of Dupuy's main points, criticisms of Ashby and his whole approach, that it sort of starts out so abstractly that it never able to move beyond its own abstractions. Like it just doesn't know. I mean, it's really hard to specify anything more concretely within his framework. I think he would, and it's also hard to just try to apply this to anything specific. So yeah, that's
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so would anybody have any question about the second part about the social sciences or humanities, this relationship?
I also have a question, which is if anybody feels they could chime in. I'm really interested in Ashby's critique of self-organization, and if anybody has like any insights on whether you could move beyond this critique within, like, let's say, mainstream science today or mainstream physics or anything like that, like the direction which also Dupuy kind of implies.
I mean, I'm not sure I understand in a certain sense his point, basically that it's not the system itself in a certain sense that is self-referential, but a certain segment within a system that is kind of dominating within itself, and it cannot get out of this. If I understood you correctly, what would need to happen is precisely this capacity to change the rules of the game for the whole system, so that the system would somehow. I think that this requires, but this is not going to be a satisfying solution because it kind of changes the narrative. But something that I was saying already, like the segment of transcendence, where you really have to have a certain moment where. This is why you probably dislike him, and I do find him interesting, even though I'm not particularly fond of the way he presents things, Glissner, namely. So this element of going of the organism constantly being outside of itself, both in the sense of beyond itself and within itself, I really like that, because it emphasizes the dynamism that, for example, these Ashby models cannot really capture. They're still like extremely static models. They're circular and everything, but you know, you have a structure that is kind of undergoing changes, but it's not really the movement itself, so to speak. So
No,
I don't know. I don't have the impression that this solves something, but I would assume that maybe that's a certain way of starting to think about what it would mean to undergo the change of the system as a whole and not being guided by a certain something that is within it. What this means, yeah.
Sorry. No, yeah. I would just like to add that I totally agree with you, and in this sense, Glissner is also very interesting to me, and precisely. I mean, I have just the only issue I have is that I'm unable to.
Yeah, what do you
conceptualize
do with that, right?
this?
Yeah,
what
do you do
with
that? Yeah. I know.
This is. I mean, and it's also this is the one thing that really leaves me unsatisfied with Ashby, because I totally agree that in one sense it's a very static model, and yeah, I mean, how do you go beyond that? That's the only question that I have.
Yeah. Anyway, the thing is that I've also said that maybe we could, towards the end of the meeting, say a few words about just, you know, to kind of wrap things up and maybe do a little bit of brainstorming about if we could figure out some potential future steps for collaborations and whatnot. So maybe I would just repeat the question. There's a lot of things happening on the social level and the level of humanities, and just if somebody was really intrigued by that, and if they would like to ask something with regards to this, the whole you know, I found this, I'm not going to go into it, but I found this idea about the way he drew the parallels between what Hayek was doing and the other segments, and I completely agree with what you said. I also, to be honest, am not sure what his final point is. So I was struck by something very similar. This you have the impression that he's satisfied with something that happened, but you also see that for him this was also something that's really bad. But I wasn't able to elucidate what it was that he tries to kind of point. At the beginning, if you remember, he was constantly talking about this necessity to preserve somehow the element of the personal and all of that. So, but how it fits with the way he portrays the whole thing, I don't know. So okay, so if nobody has any questions with regards to these things, I'm going to stop this now, stop the recording, and we can just have a more informal discussion about things.